Thank you. Shannon Ross Miller. I doubt that too many people in this room have heard her name. She's a 30-something, mother of 3, lives in Montana with her husband, rural Montana, south of the Canadian border. Now, by day, she's a mild-mannered paralegal. But by night, while her family sleeps, she's online, tracking terrorists, posing as a member of Al-Qaeda, an Al-Qaeda operative. And she's had some success. She's actually responsible for the prosecution and conviction of 2 domestic terrorists. One who had in mind to blow up the Alaska pipeline, and the second was a National Guardsman convicted in 2004 of espionage. I bring her up because she's an example of a researcher, of a private citizen, looking at these types of issues and conveying to the government information to which it otherwise would not have access. There are others like her. Rita Katz was responsible, at least in the initial stages, for going after the Holy Land Foundation. This was mentioned earlier, but this was at the time the largest Islamic charity in the United States. In 2009, its leadership was finally convicted of funneling over $10 million to Hamas. So she'd gone undercover and provided some of the initial information that permitted the government to pursue the case. Very important. A third area in which these types of researchers and analysts are very helpful is in defending the government as the government pursues terrorists. In situations where the government itself is either unwilling or unable to vindicate itself. Now, I think a very good example of this is the situation involving Mohammed al-Duri from 2000. This was a situation, a very sad case, involving a 12-year-old boy who was killed in a crossfire between Israeli and Palestinians. Again, in 2000, it was caught on camera, and it was spread throughout the Muslim world. People were very angry about it. In fact, Osama bin Laden made reference to it in one of his tapes that came out after 9/11. He says, you know, you Americans, you'd better remember this because we certainly do, and we're going to come after you. Now, subsequent investigation revealed that, in fact, what had killed the child was not the Israeli bullets. Now, this was actually revealed, argued anyway, in the Atlantic Monthly in 2003 by someone named James Fowler, who's not a raving right-winger. In fact, was a former speechwriter for President Carter. And he writes here, and it's very important to see how he reached this conclusion. What was the source of this evidence? The exculpatory evidence comes not from government or military officials in Israel who have an obvious interest in claiming their soldiers weren't responsible. In other words, you can't believe them anyway because they're going to lie even if they wanted to defend themselves. Who would believe it? In fact, the IDF seems to prefer to soft-pedal the findings rather than bring any more attention to this gruesome episode. Even if they could defend themselves for PR reasons, they might want to just move past it. So how do you know? The research has been done by a variety of academics, ex-soldiers, and webloggers who've become obsessed with the case, and the evidence can be cross-checked. So the vindication came not from the government, but from these outside researchers and authors, and this is a very important role. They help identify terrorists, they help identify sources of terrorism funding, and they help justify government action when the government is charged with false but very damaging crimes. The difficulty that arises is there's not that many people doing it. We estimate between 150 and perhaps 200 in the United States, and it's not a particularly lucrative profession. So the Islamists and their allies have realized that a great way to try to silence them and shut them up is to file these predatory lawsuits. Now, what's a predatory lawsuit? We've had some discussion of this before. It's a lawsuit that's not necessarily designed to win, but simply to harass, oppress, bankrupt, intimidate the opponent. And this can be a very effective tactic. It began, in fact, in the 1960s. You had the opponents of the civil rights reforms would go and file these suits against the New York Times and others in an attempt to silence them. And now they're doing the same thing. The Islamists have gotten wise to it and have realized that this is a great complement to their violent tactics. So you have the statement, for example, in 2009 by Mahdi Bray, who's the executive director of the Muslim American Legal Society Freedom Foundation. He has a radio show, and he said there, we've got to be willing to spend our money in a court of law, and not necessarily because we're going to look for money. In other words, not necessarily because we're going to win, but to spend our money and make you spend your money. And indeed they have, and there are a great deal of examples, and I'll cite two. Rita Katz, I mentioned her earlier, she was involved in another campaign to identify terrorism funding. This was in the early 2000s. She provided information for something that was called Operation Green Quest. This was the largest effort against suspected terrorism funding in the United States. And certain people were convicted, somebody was deported, but in the course of it, somebody sued her for providing information to the government. Now, the case was ultimately dismissed, but it cost her $43,000. It's not an insignificant sum of money. It's perhaps a year at the Columbia Law School. I'll have to ask the dean. At any rate, that's one example. Another more recent one is Hassan Dai. He's someone at the legal project that we're working with. He is a staunch opponent of the Iranian regime, and for good reason. And one thing he's been doing is going after a group called the National American Iranian Council. This is a DC-based group, and he alleges, on the basis of some evidence, that they are in fact a front for the Iranian regime, lobbying Congress to suspend the sanctions and so forth. Now, NIAC, this is the organization, they come back at him and they sued him for libel. And it's been dragging him out, and he spoke in 2009 about this suit. He said, you know, when I first got this, I thought, well, you know, they're trying to intimidate me, and I won't be intimidated, and I'm going to stand up. But then, like Politican, he suddenly realized that it's difficult to stand up to these suits, and he thought, I'm running out of money, and what's going to happen? And so the tactic can be very, very effective. And that is where the legal project comes in. What we do is we help assist authors and researchers, people who are studying radical Islam, people who are producing information that's vital to the government, and we go in there and we say, all right, you're being sued, we can provide you legal advice, we can provide you financial assistance. And the way we do this is, A, we do fundraising and try to put money into accounts to help defray the legal costs. But the second thing is, we maintain an international network of pro bono attorneys. So people like you in this room who have some time and say, this is important, I'm going to focus on this, I want you to be able to speak freely about these issues and help the government. And in fact, we're able to assist a great many people this way. And I mentioned Hassan Dai. In fact, in this room now, we have Mr. Tim Capshandy, who is assisting, along with us, is assisting Mr. Hassan Dai in his case against NIAC. And it's a very long, time-consuming matter, but he's doing excellent work on it. And this is precisely the type of thing that we need to do to make sure that this small group of people who are providing vital information are permitted to continue to do so. Now, of course, this is insufficient because, okay, well, someone's been sued and we're going to help them, but that's kind of like a first responder. There's a bigger problem at issue, and that's why the legal project is working with governments on a policy level to try to change laws and close loopholes and make it a lot more difficult to file these types of suits at the outset. So one thing we're doing, for example, there was talk before of Britain's plaintiff-friendly libel regime that's used to silence people talking about terrorism financing. And they're now actually reviewing their laws because they've realized that there may be a chilling effect on free speech, and we're helping advise them on particular issues and cases, and they expect a report sometime this month. Another thing we do in the United States, you have certain laws that are designed to prevent libel tourism. This was mentioned before, which is, again, intimidating U.S. authors by suing them in foreign jurisdictions less protective of free speech. So we're involved in all sorts of that to try to stop this thing at a policy level rather than just merely at the individual level. And another area in which I think we're really quite focused, and this is something that I personally did not know a great deal about until I began working on the legal project, and I think it's of great importance and people aren't aware of it, is other areas in which Islamists and their allies are working to suppress free speech on issues regarding radical Islam and related matters. So you have, and it was, I guess it was cited but not discussed earlier, the point about the Organization of the Islamic Conference. They're trying to push through a defamation of religions resolutions in the UN. Now, to give you an idea of what this actually means, it's not just saying something horrible about Muhammad. The way they think about this is anything really insulting to Islam. And a good example is I think there were certain NGOs which are making a presentation to the UN in 2008, talking about female genital mutilation and other things and relating that to Islamic law. And Pakistan and Egypt became so incensed about it that they essentially shut them up and said, no more discussion of this. This is a serious issue. It ought to be able to discuss. And when they talk about defamation of Islam, they're talking about stopping this type of legitimate discussion. So it's a very serious matter. And you might think, well, who cares, in the end, no one pays attention to these resolutions anyway. But no, now there are two reasons to be worried. Number one, they're trying to push a treaty amendment. And number two, the United States, in its zeal to curry favor with the Muslim nations, is in fact yielding somewhat, and it's what was previously staunch opposition. So they collaborated with Egypt. This is just in the fall of 2009. On a resolution which didn't go so far as to say, no defamation of religions, but it said it condemned media organizations and other people who are engaged in remarks that tend to consist of negative stereotypes. This is a very strange thing. It's never done before, and the UN Human Rights Committee was really quite shocked that the United States would take this step. And you might say, well, in any event, it doesn't matter. We still have the First Amendment, but that's not so. The contours of the First Amendment are not clearly defined. People are still working on these issues, and to the extent you believe in a living constitution and evolving standards, looking to international norms, it's quite possible that you might at some point down the line have an exception carved out in the First Amendment for Islamophobia and hate speech. And just on the final point, because hate speech has been spoken about before, I do think that you have to look not at the conceptual idea, but what is the practical danger? In fact, I'm not an expert in the history of the Weimar Republic, but I do know that Germany did have various regulations against speech that was deemed offensive at the time that Hitler was rising to power. So that really wasn't the issue. The problem was that they did not enforce them. Now, I suppose again, not being an expert, I can't say for sure, but I would say that the evidence is at least mixed on this question. But what does seem undisputed is that the net effect of these types of laws is to kill important debate. And we saw that most dramatically at the Fort Hood matter, where you had people murdered. And
your time is up.
Reported that people were aware of the problem but didn't report it because they were afraid of seeming to be anti-Islamic. So it's a very serious matter, and I hope you'll look at our website, legalproject.org, legal-project.org.